The first sign that Thornwood Manor still lived came not from sight, but from sound, the groan of iron hinges protesting against 3 decades of silence as the eastern gate swung open for the first time since the last heir had locked it behind him in the winter of 1894. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The afternoon sun slanted through ancient oaks as Thomas Ashford stood before the manor that had haunted his dreams since childhood. At 42, he had finally gathered the courage and the means to return to the estate that his grandfather had abandoned, taking with him only a single leather case and a burden of secrets he would carry to his grave. The manor rose before Thomas like a ghost made solid, its gray stone walls mantled in ivy that had grown thick as a man's wrist, its windows dark and watchful beneath gables that pierced the sky like accusations. 3 decades. An entire generation had passed while Thornwood slumbered, and now Thomas had come to wake it. He moved through the gate slowly, his boots crunching on gravel that had once been raked smooth each morning by groundskeepers whose names were recorded in ledgers somewhere in the Manor-esque depths. Weeds pushed through the stones now, reclaiming what human hands had ordered. The circular drive, which had once welcomed carriages bearing guests in silk and velvet, bore only the tracks of foxes and deer. Nature, patient and persistent, had begun the work of erasure. The great oak door stood 12 feet high, its surface carved with the Ashford coat of arms. A raven perched upon a crown of thorns, wings spread in eternal vigilance. Thomas withdrew the iron key from his pocket, feeling its weight. His grandfather had pressed it into his palm during their last meeting, when Thomas was only 12, his young hand barely large enough to close around it. "You'll know when it's time," the old man had said, his voice rough as wind through winter branches. "The house will call you back." They always do. Thomas had not understood then. He understood now. The key turned with surprising ease, as though the lock had been waiting, ready. The sound it made echoed across the grounds, sharp as a word spoken in an empty cathedral. Thomas pushed, and the door yielded, releasing a breath of air that smelled of dust and time and something else, something like rosemary and old, books and beeswax candles, the ghost of the manor's former life. Darkness pooled inside the entrance hall. Thomas stepped across the threshold, and his footfall on marble tile rang through spaces that had known only silence for so long. Slowly his eyes adjusted, and the hall revealed itself in degrees. A grand staircase swept upward to the second floor, its banister carved from mahogany that had sailed from distant colonies a century before. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashfords staring down with expressions that ranged from stern to melancholy to proud. Dust cloths covered the furniture like shrouds. He walked to the nearest window and pulled back the heavy curtains. They resisted, their fabric stiff with age, but yielded at last, and afternoon light spilled into the hall with the quality of liquid gold, illuminating everything it touched. Dust motes danced in the beams like tiny spirits celebrating the return of warmth. The light revealed details that darkness had hidden, the intricate plasterwork of the ceiling, molded into scenes of pastoral abundance. The geometric precision of the floor's black and white marble, the bronze fixtures that still gleamed despite their coating of neglect. Thomas moved from window to window, drawing back each curtain. letting light reclaim the manor room by room. Each window he uncovered framed a different view of the grounds, the overgrown gardens to the east, the stable yard to the west, the forest that pressed close against the northern wing like an old friend leaning in to whisper secrets. In the library he paused. Here was his grandfather's favorite room, where the old man had spent his final years at Thornwood before whatever had happened, whatever had driven him away. The shelves still held their volumes, thousands of them, their leather spines forming a patchwork of burgundy and forest green and midnight blue. A reading chair sat by the fireplace, and on the small table beside it, Thomas found a book still lying open, as though its reader had merely stepped away for a moment and might return at any time. He lifted it carefully, mindful of pages grown brittle. The text was poetry Wordsworth, opened to Tintern Abbey. Someone had underlined a passage. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. He set the book down gently and continued his circuit of the ground floor. The morning room where ladies had once taken tea and discussed matters of fashion and charity. The dining hall, its long table, capable of seating 20, its walls hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes. The music room, housing a pianoforte that would need tuning, its keys yellow as old teeth. The conservatory, where tropical plants had once flourished and manufactured warmth, now filled with the desiccated remains of what they had been. In each room, Thomas performed the same ritual, pulling back curtains, opening windows where their mechanisms still functioned, allowing air and light to begin the work of restoration. He moved with a sense of purpose that felt almost ceremonial, as though he were not simply airing out old rooms, but conducting some ancient rite of awakening. The kitchen occupied the entire western wing of the ground floor, a cavernous space built to feed not just the family, but the small army of servants required to maintain an estate of Thornwood-esque magnitude. The great iron range stood cold and silent, but the copper pots still hung from their hooks, tarnished green. The work tables bore the scars of 1,000 meals prepared, and when Thomas ran his hand across their surfaces, he could almost hear the clatter of knives on wood, the murmur of kitchen staff moving through their routines with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. A door in the kitchen led down to the cellars. Thomas descended the stone steps, his lantern throwing wild shadows. The air grew cooler with each step, and the smell of earth intensified. The wine cellars still held dusty bottles in their racks, a fortune in aged vintages that had been left behind. Beyond it lay the storage rooms where preserves had been kept, the old ice room with its thick walls, and the root cellar where vegetables had been stored through winter months. But it was the furthest room that gave Thomas pause. His grandfather had mentioned it only once, and only in warning. "There's a chamber in the deepest cellar," the old man had said, "that must remain locked. Whatever you do when you return to Thornwood, leave that door sealed." Thomas found it now, set into the stone wall at the cellar's terminus. Unlike the other doors, which were wood, this one was iron, and its lock was not a keyhole but a combination mechanism of unusual complexity. He studied it in the lantern light, noting the symbols carved around its edge, not letters, but signs he did not recognize, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. He did not try to open it, not yet. There would be time enough for secrets. Returning upstairs, Thomas made his way to the second floor. Here the family's private chambers awaited. His grandfather's room faced east, positioned to catch the morning sun. Thomas entered and found it preserved like an exhibit in a museum. The bed remained made, its coverlet smooth. Clothes still hung in the wardrobe, smelling of cedar and lavender. On the desk, papers lay scattered as though their writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. Thomas approached the desk and began to examine the papers. They were letters, most of them, written in his grandfather's precise hand. Some were addressed to solicitors discussing matters of estate management. Others were personal correspondence, replies to friends and relatives. But one letter, undated and unsent, caught Thomas's attention. It began, "To whoever finds themselves master of Thornwood after I am gone." He read it slowly, his grandfather's voice echoing in his mind as he traced the familiar handwriting. "You will discover, as I did, that this house is more than stone and timber. It lives in ways that cannot be easily explained, only experienced. It remembers, and it reveals what it remembers to those patient enough to listen. I have not abandoned Thornwood out of fear, but out of respect for forces I do not fully understand. The manor has stood for 300 years, and it will stand for 300 more, but it requires guardians who understand that they serve the house as much as the house serves them. In the locked chamber in the lowest cellar, you will find the heart of Thornwood's mystery. I urge you to approach it with caution and with reverence. What is kept there has been kept for good reason, and its revelation could bring either great wisdom or great sorrow. The choice of whether to look will be yours, as it was mine, as it was my father's before me. Know that I love this house, even as I fled from it. May you have the strength I lacked to see its secrets through to their conclusion." The letter ended without signature, as though even putting his name to such words had proven too much. Thomas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Outside the window, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The manor's shadow stretched long across the eastern lawn, reaching toward the forest, like a hand seeking something just beyond its grasp. He spent the remaining hours of daylight on the second floor, opening rooms one by one. The nursery where generations of Ashford children had played, its rocking horse frozen mid-gallop. The governess's room, austere and simple. The guest chambers, each decorated in different themes, one in chinoiserie with hand-painted wallpaper depicting scenes of oriental gardens, another in the Gothic style with pointed arches and dark wood paneling, a third in pastoral simplicity with floral prints and whitewashed furniture. In what had been his own room during childhood visits, Thomas found toys he had left behind, lead soldiers arranged in battle formation, a wooden ship he had never quite finished building, books of adventure stories with his name inscribed in childish handwriting on their fly-leaves. Seeing them now filled him with a strange melancholy, as though he had stumbled upon artifacts from another life entirely, one belonging to a boy who had believed the world was simpler than it proved to be. As darkness gathered, Thomas made his way to the master suite on the western side of the second floor. These had been his great-grandparents' rooms, later occupied by his grandparents, and now, by right of inheritance, his own. The sitting room connected to a bedroom, which connected in turn to a dressing room and private bath, a luxury added in the 1880s when the manor had been partially modernized. He stood in the bedroom looking at the four-poster bed with its heavy curtains, the fireplace large enough to warm the entire space, the windows that overlooked the rear gardens and beyond them, the shimmer of the lake that marked the southern boundary of the estate. Tomorrow he would begin the real work, cataloging what needed repair, engaging contractors, bringing the manor back to habitability. But tonight He would sleep in Thornwood for the first time in 30 years. He had brought supplies in his automobile, which he had left parked in the circular drive a bedroll, lanterns, food enough for several days. He retrieved these now, moving through the darkening house with growing familiarity. The manor seemed less forbidding now than it had when he had first arrived. Or perhaps he was simply becoming accustomed to its particular quality of silence, the way it held sound, and released it in unexpected echoes. In the kitchen, he found that the hand pump still functioned, drawing water from the deep well that had served the manor for centuries. The water ran rusty at first, clearing after several minutes of pumping. He filled a kettle and managed to coax fire from the range, using kindling and logs he found stacked in the wood box-dried to perfect tinder after decades of waiting. He made tea and sat at the great wooden table where servants had once taken their meals, listening to the house settle around him. Old buildings spoke in the language of contracting timber and cooling stone, telling stories of the day's heat leaving, of weight redistributing, of the endless conversation between structure and gravity. Thornwood's voice was deep and complex, a symphony of small sounds that combined into something almost musical. After his simple meal, Thomas climbed the stairs once more, his lantern casting his shadow huge upon the walls. In the master bedroom he built a fire in the hearth more for light than warmth on this mild spring evening. He spread his bedroll before the fireplace and lay down, watching flames dance across seasoned wood. Sleep should have come easily after the long day, but his mind remained active, turning over everything he had seen, everything he had found. The letter from his grandfather troubled him particularly. What was locked in that cellar room? What had driven the old man away after a lifetime at Thornwood? The fire burned low, and Thomas's eyes grew heavy at last. His final waking thought was of the manor breathing around him, its great lungs of stone, and timber drawing in the night and releasing it slowly, keeping time with rhythms far older than any human inhabitant. He dreamed of corridors that went deeper than the cellars he had explored, of rooms beyond rooms beyond rooms, of a vast architecture that existed somehow inside Thornwood's walls, despite being far too large to fit within them. In the dream, he followed a light that moved always ahead of him, turning corners just before he could see what carried it. And somewhere in the depths of this impossible manor, a door stood open, and from beyond it came a sound like singing, or perhaps like the wind through a forest of crystal trees. He woke to find dawn light streaming through the windows, and the fire reduced to ash. For a moment he could not remember where he was, and then it all returned, Thornwood, his return, the work that lay ahead. Thomas rose and stretched, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. He performed his morning ablutions with cold water from the pump, then breakfasted on bread and cheese from his supplies. Today he would begin the systematic documentation of the manor's condition, starting from the attics and working down through every floor, every room, making notes of what required attention. The attics occupied the entire length of the manor, beneath the steep, pitched roof. Access was through a door on the second floor that opened onto a narrow stairway. Thomas climbed with his lantern, for the attics had only small windows set into the gables, and even on a bright morning their light barely penetrated the accumulated shadows. What he found was a treasury of the past. Trunks filled with clothing from bygone eras, their fabric still rich despite the years' silk gowns and velvet cloaks and wool coats with brass buttons. Furniture that had gone out of fashion, but had been too valuable to discard, sat under canvas sheets. Paintings leaned against the walls, portraits of Ashfords whose names Thomas did not know, landscapes of places he could not identify. Boxes contained correspondence, financial records, household accounts going back to the Manor's construction in the early 17th century. Thomas spent hours in the attics, examining what he found with the care of an archaeologist. Here was the physical memory of his family, the accumulated debris of lives lived and concluded. He found his great-grandmother's wedding dress, preserved in tissue paper, the white silk yellowed to cream, but still intact. He found his great-grandfather's military uniform from the Crimean War, the red coat faded to pink, the gold braid tarnished. He found toys that had belonged to children whose portraits hung downstairs, a porcelain doll with a cracked face, a rocking horse worn smooth by enthusiastic riding, a toy theater, complete with tiny actors and painted scenery. In a leather case pushed far back under the eaves, Thomas discovered a collection of journals. He pulled them out carefully and opened the first one. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink brown with age, but the words were clear. January 1st, 1725. This day I begin my account of Thornwood Manor, that those who come after might understand what I have understood, and know what I have known. The journal's author was Edmund Ashford, who had built Thornwood. Thomas sat on a dusty trunk and began to read, and as he read, the manor's history came alive. Edmund had been a merchant who had made his fortune in the wool trade, buying the estate as land from an impoverished nobleman and building Thornwood as a statement of his arrival among the gentry. But he had chosen the location for reasons beyond mere ambition. There is something in this land, Edmund wrote, that speaks to those who listen. The ancient forest knows secrets, and the lake reflects more than sky. I build here because I sense that Thornwood is meant to be built, that some purpose beyond my understanding calls for a house in this place. Thomas read on, fascinated. Edmund described the construction process, the challenges of building in a location far from major roads, the skilled craftsmen he had brought from distant cities, the local workers who had warned him against building on marked ground. But he had persisted, and Thornwood had risen, stone by stone, timber by timber, until it stood complete, a manor house of 30 rooms, with gardens and stables and all the appointments of a gentleman's estate. But the truly interesting passages began after Thornwood's completion, when Edmund and his family took up residence. "We have been in the house 1 month," Edmund wrote, "and already I perceive that it has qualities I did not anticipate. Sounds carry strangely through the corridors. Shadows fall at unexpected angles. And there are moments, especially in the hours between night and morning, when I feel certain that the house is aware of us, as we are aware of it." Edmund's subsequent entries detailed strange occurrences, doors that would be found open though they had been locked, footsteps heard in empty rooms, the sense of being watched even when alone. But Edmund did not write of these things with fear. Instead, his tone was one of fascination, even wonder. "I begin to believe," he wrote, "that Thornwood is not merely a structure we inhabit, but rather a kind of being with which we are learning to coexist. It has moods and preferences. It responds to our presence. I find this not frightening, but rather marvelous, to think that human skill has created something that transcends its materials and becomes, in some sense, alive." Thomas looked up from the journal, his mind reeling. The morning had advanced toward afternoon while he read, and now dust motes drifted through the attic's dim light like suspended stars. He thought of the letter his grandfather had left, of the warning about the locked chamber in the cellar, of his own strange dreams the previous night. He gathered the journals. There were 12 volumes in all, spanning Edmund's lifetime, and carried them down to the library, where he placed them carefully on a reading table. These would require further study, careful attention. They were clearly important to understanding not just the manor's history, but its essential nature. The rest of the afternoon Thomas spent in practical matters. He walked the exterior of the manor, noting where slate tiles had slipped from the roof, where gutters had come loose, where ivy had worked its way into mortar joints and would need to be carefully removed. The stable building required significant repair. Its roof had partially collapsed, and weather had damaged the interior. The carriage house was in better condition, built more sturdily and better maintained before the abandonment. The gardens were perhaps the most melancholy sight. What had once been formal beds now grew wild, ornamental plants mixed with weeds in chaotic profusion. The gravel paths had disappeared under encroaching grass. The fountain in the center of the rose garden stood dry, its basin filled with fallen leaves. But even in their overgrown state, the gardens retained a kind of beauty, as though nature had decided to create its own artwork using the structured design as a starting point. At the southern edge of the gardens, Thomas found the path that led down to the lake. He followed it through a grove of ancient willows, their branches trailing in the water like the hair of drowned maidens. The lake spread before him, perhaps a mile across, its surface reflecting the clouds that drifted overhead. A small boathouse stood at the water's edge, its dock rotted through in places, but still recognizable. Thomas stood at the water's edge and felt something he had not felt since childhood, a sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. Thornwood was his now, truly his, not just by legal inheritance, but by something deeper, something he could not name, but could only feel, a rightness that went bone deep. He stayed by the lake until the sun began to set, watching light change the water from blue to gold to silver. When he finally returned to the manor, the windows glowed with the last daylight, and the building seemed to welcome him, its door standing open as he had left it, its interior shadows soft by the approaching dusk. That evening Thomas made his second fire in the bedroom hearth and sat reading Edmund's journals by its light. The first volume covered the manor's construction and the family's initial years in residence. The second volume, which Thomas opened as the fire crackled, dealt with Edmund's growing understanding of Thornwood's unusual nature. "I have begun to experiment," Edmund wrote, "with the house's responsiveness. I find that if I speak to it, not aloud, but in my thoughts, it seems to answer, not in words, but in sensations, in the way light falls through a window, or the way a door swings open. My wife thinks I am growing fanciful, but I know what I experience. Thornwood is listening." Edmund described a growing rapport with the manor, a relationship that deepened over years. He would ask questions of the house and receive answers in dreams. He would sense when something needed attention, a loose tile, a developing rot, before physical inspection revealed the problem. He began to think of himself not as Thornwood's master, but as its steward, its partner in the work of existing. Tonight, one entry read, "I descended to the cellars to retrieve wine for dinner, and I found a door I had never seen before. It stood in the deepest chamber, set into the stone wall as though it had always been there, though I am certain it was not present when we first took residence. The door was locked, and though I tried every key in my possession, none would turn its mechanism. I am forced to conclude that Thornwood has created this door for purposes of its own, and until it wishes me to pass through, I shall not pass. Thomas set down the journal and stared into the fire. Edmund had found the same door nearly 2 centuries ago, the door his grandfather had warned him against opening. A door that, if Edmund could be believed, the house itself had created. He picked up the 3rd volume and continued reading. Edmund's entries grew more philosophical as he aged, less concerned with daily occurrences, and more focused on the meaning of his relationship with Thornwood. I have come to understand, Edmund wrote, that some houses are merely buildings, arrangements of material to serve human purposes, but others rear others become something more. They accumulate intention and memory until they achieve a kind of consciousness, rudimentary perhaps, but real nonetheless. Thornwood is such a house. It was designed to be this from the beginning, though I did not know it when I drew the plans. Some wisdom older than my own guided my hand. The 4th volume revealed that Edmund's wife had died in childbirth, along with the child, when Edmund was 53. His grief poured from the pages. I am alone now in this vast house, save for the servants, and yet I do not feel truly alone. Thornwood grieves with me. The rooms echo with a sorrow that is not solely my own. We are companions in loss. Thomas read late into the night, unable to stop despite his growing fatigue. Edmund had lived another 30 years after his wife's death, becoming increasingly reclusive, dedicating himself to understanding Thornwood's mysteries. And his final entries, written in a shaking hand, Edmund described at last opening the mysterious door. I am old now, and death approaches. I can feel it in my bones, hear it in the labor of my heart. Before I go, I must know what lies beyond the locked door. Today I found it standing open, though I had tried it only yesterday and found it sealed. I descended the stairs I discovered beyond it, stairs that led deeper than the cellar's foundation should allow, down into the living rock of the earth itself. What I found there I shall not commit to these pages. It is enough to say that I understand now why Thornwood was built here, what purpose it serves. I am humbled and awed and terrified and grateful all at once. May whoever comes after me have the courage to descend when their time comes. The journal ended there. Thomas checked the dates. Edmund had died a week after that final entry. He closed the volume and sat back, his mind spinning. The fire had burned low, and the room had grown cold. Outside the windows, the night was complete, moonless, and dark. Thomas rose and looked out over the gardens he could not see, toward the lake he knew was there, though invisible in the darkness. What had Edmund found? What lay beyond the locked door, downstairs that should not exist? Thomas knew he would have to find out. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. The mystery pulled at him with the same gravity that had pulled him back to Thornwood after 30 years away. He had returned not just to restore a building, but to complete something his grandfather had left unfinished, something Edmund had begun and subsequent generations had continued or fled from according to their natures. He slept that night deeply, dreamlessly, and woke to rain pattering against the windows. The sound was soothing, hypnotic, and Thomas lay listening to it for a long time before rising. Rain on Thornwood's roof, rain in its gardens, rain on its lake, it all seemed right somehow, as though the Manor had been waiting for precisely this weather to welcome him fully. He spent the rainy days that followed exploring the ground floor more thoroughly, making detailed notes about the state of each room, what furnishings could be saved, and what would need replacing, which walls showed signs of damp or settling. He found the house's original plans in a drawer in the study, yellowed and brittle, but still legible, Edmund's careful drafting showing the manor's layout in precise detail. Comparing the plans to the actual structure, Thomas noticed something odd. The cellars, as drawn, showed only the rooms he had already discovered: the wine cellar, the storage rooms, the old ice chamber. There was no indication of any additional space, no mysterious locked room. He checked the date on the plans, 1723, 2 years before Edmund had laid the foundation. So either the room had been a later addition, or it had never been part of any formal design. Edmund's journal suggested the latter, that the room had somehow appeared, or perhaps had always been there but had only revealed itself when the time was right. The rational part of Thomas's mind rejected this as impossible. Houses did not create rooms. Doors did not manifest from nothing. And yet Edmund's account was detailed and sober, written by a man who had been, by all evidence, sound in mind and successful in business, not given to flights of fancy. On the 4th morning the rain cleared, and Thomas decided it was time to hire help. The manor was too large for one person to restore alone. He drove into the nearest village, a journey of 6 miles along roads that had been improved somewhat since his childhood visits, but remained narrow and winding. The village was called Ashford Cross, named for the crossroads at its center, and for the family that had been its primary landowner for 3 centuries. Thomas found the local contractor at the village inn, where such business was traditionally conducted. The man's name was Robert Graves, a solid, practical person in his 50s who listened without judgment as Thomas described what was needed at Thornwood. "The manor, is it?" Graves said, stroking his beard. "Thought it would stay empty forever, the way things were going. But if you're serious about restoring it, I can find you men who'll do the work. Good men, though I'll warn you some folk hereabouts won't go near Thornwood. Say it's unlucky." "Unlucky how?" Thomas asked. Graves shrugged. "Old stories mostly, nothing specific, just a feeling the place has. But like I said, I can find you workers who aren't troubled by such things. When would you want them to start?" "As soon as possible," Thomas said. "I want the roof secured first, before the next rain. Then we'll work through the rest." They settled on terms, and Graves promised to have a crew at the manor within 3 days. Thomas spent the rest of the day in the village, purchasing supplies and reintroducing himself to shopkeepers who remembered him as a boy. Most were welcoming, though he detected a reserve in some, a wariness that seemed connected to his plans for Thornwood. At the general store, the proprietor's wife leaned across the counter and spoke in a low voice. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Ashford, but are you quite sure about taking up residence at the manor? Your grandfather had his reasons for leaving, you know." "What reasons were those?" Thomas asked. She glanced around as though checking for eavesdroppers, though they were alone in the shop. "He never said, not exactly. But he left in a terrible hurry, and he never came back, not even once. Sold off the livestock and dismissed the servants all in one day, packed a single case, and drove away. We thought at first some tragedy had occurred, but then word came he was well, just unwilling to return. It seemed odd is all." "Houses can't hurt people," Thomas said gently. "No," she agreed, "but they can disturb them. And Thornwood has always been a disturbing kind of place, if you take my meaning." Thomas thanked her for her concern and assured her he would be careful. But as he drove back to the manor with his supplies, her words echoed in his mind. His grandfather had left in a terrible hurry, abandoning Thornwood with a finality that spoke of fear or disgust or both. What had he seen? What had driven him away? Thomas resolved to search his grandfather's room more thoroughly for any clues the old man might have left beyond the single letter. That evening, after unloading his supplies, he returned to the bedroom that had been his grandfather's and began a systematic search. In the desk drawers he found correspondence related to the estate's management, bills and receipts and contracts with tradesmen. In the wardrobe, alongside the hanging clothes, he found a strong-box. It was locked, but Thomas discovered the key taped to the underside of a drawer. Inside the strong-box he found a bundle of papers tied with string. He untied the bundle and spread the papers on the desk. They were sketches, dozens of them, all depicting the same subject, the locked door in the cellar. His grandfather had drawn it from every angle, noting details of its construction, the symbols carved around its frame, the mechanism of its lock. And beneath the sketches, Thomas found pages of handwritten notes. The door responds to more than physical keys, his grandfather had written. I have observed it over many months, and I believe it opens according to some internal logic of the house itself. It was sealed when I first discovered it, remained sealed throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Then one morning I found it standing ajar. I descended the stairs beyond and saw what Edmund saw, what perhaps every Ashford who has lived at Thornwood eventually sees. I cannot say what it is. Words fail, but I understand now why Edmund built here, what covenant was made, what bargain struck. The notes went on, growing more frantic. The house wants a guardian, someone to witness what it guards, to maintain the compact. But I am not strong enough. I thought I was, but I am not. The weight of it crushes me. I must leave. I must place distance between myself and Thornwood, or I will be consumed by the obligation I cannot fulfill. Thomas read and reread these words, trying to extract their full meaning. A covenant, a bargain? What had his grandfather seen beyond that door that had driven him away? He gathered the papers and took them down to the library, where he spread them on a table beside Edmund's journals. Here was a puzzle, pieces of which were scattered across 2 centuries. Edmund had embraced the mystery, had welcomed it. Thomas's grandfather had fled from it. And now Thomas stood at the threshold of decision, knowing that soon he would have to choose his own path. The workers arrived 3 days later, as Graves had promised, a crew of 5 men with ladders and tools and materials. They set to work on the roof, and soon the sound of hammering echoed across the grounds. Thomas watched them labor with satisfaction. This was progress, visible and measurable, the kind that made sense. Over the following weeks, the restoration proceeded steadily. The roof was secured, its damaged slates replaced, and its flashing repaired. The gutters were cleaned and refastened. Windows that had swollen shut were freed, their sashes planed smooth. Walls that showed damp were opened, their causes identified and remedied. Gradually, Thornwood shed its aspect of abandonment and began to look like a house that was lived in, cared for, loved. Thomas hired a housekeeper from the village, a widow named Mrs. Bramwell, who had worked at the manor in her youth and remembered its layout. She arrived with her sleeves rolled up and set about cleaning with a vigor that suggested personal offense at the state of neglect. Within days the entrance hall gleamed, its marble floors polished, its brass fixtures shining. She worked her way through the ground floor, room by room, and the manor seemed to sigh with relief as each space was restored to order. It's a happy house, Mrs. Bramwell said one afternoon, pausing in her work to look around the morning room. "I can feel it. Pleased to have people in it again." Thomas, who had begun to think of the house in similar terms, asked, "Did you ever hear anything unusual about Thornwood?" "When you worked here before?" Mrs. Bramwell considered. "Nothing frightening, if that's what you mean. But the old staff used to say the house helped with the work, in small ways. You'd set something down and find it later exactly where you needed it, even if that wasn't where you'd left it. Or you'd forget to close a window and find it closed when you remembered. Little things. Nothing you could quite pin down, but enough to make you think the house was paying attention." She returned to her polishing, leaving Thomas to contemplate this new piece of information. A house that helped, that paid attention, that moved things to where they needed to be. It aligned with Edmund's descriptions, with the sense Thomas himself had of Thornwood as something more than inert matter. As spring advanced toward summer, the gardens received attention. Thomas hired groundskeepers to reclaim the formal beds from wilderness, to clear the paths, to restore the fountain. It was slow work requiring judgment about what to preserve and what to remove, but gradually the gardens re-emerged, their structured beauty revealed once more beneath the years of overgrowth. Thomas spent his evenings in the library, reading Edmund's journals cover to cover, and then reading them again, searching for clues about the door, about what lay beyond it, about the choice he knew he would soon have to make. Edmund had provided descriptions of his experiences, but had stopped short of explaining exactly what the door led to, or what he had found there. "It must be seen to be understood," Edmund had written, and even then, understanding may elude. But the seeing changes you, makes you part of something larger than yourself. Summer brought long days and warm nights, and Thornwood seemed to bloom under the attention lavished upon it. Visitors began to arrive from the village, curious to see the restored manor, and Thomas found himself giving informal tours, explaining the history of various rooms, the stories of the Ashfords who had lived there. He was building a connection, not just to the house, but to the community that surrounded it, the village that had grown up in Thornwood's shadow, and whose fortunes had always been intertwined with the Manor S. One evening, as Thomas sat in the library watching the sun set through the western windows, he felt a shift. It was not a physical sensation exactly, more like a change in atmosphere, a sense that something had altered in the house's mood or intention. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens toward the lake. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, the kind of summer evening that poets wrote odes to. But Thomas knew, with a certainty he could not explain, that something had changed. He made his way down to the cellars, taking a lantern, though he knew the way by heart now, through the wine cellar, past the storage rooms, and to the deepest chamber where the iron door stood. And yes, the door was ajar, open perhaps 6 inches, revealing only darkness beyond. Thomas stood before it, his heart beating hard. This was the moment Edmund had described, the moment his grandfather had faced. The house had decided the time was right, had opened the door an invitation or challenge, or simple acknowledgment that its newest guardian was ready. He could turn back. He could go upstairs, continue the restoration, live at Thornwood without ever descending those hidden stairs. His grandfather had made that choice, had fled rather than accept what the house offered or demanded. Thomas would not be faulted for doing the same. But even as he thought this, he knew he would not turn back. He had not come all this way, invested all this effort, to stop at the threshold. Whatever lay beyond the door, he needed to see it, understand it, make his own peace with it. He pushed the door fully open. Beyond it, stairs descended into darkness, carved from living rock, disappearing into depths that should not exist beneath Thornwood's foundations. Thomas raised his lantern and began to descend. The stairs spiraled down, around and around, and Thomas counted his steps, but lost track after 200. The air grew cooler, damper, and he could hear water somewhere in the distance, a sound like an underground stream. The walls of the stairwell showed tool marks, evidence of deliberate excavation, but they also showed something else, veins of some mineral that caught the lantern light and glowed with a faint blue luminescence. Down and down he went, until he began to wonder if the stairs had any ending, if he had entered some impossible space where descent could continue forever. But then the stairs opened into a chamber, and Thomas stepped from the last stair onto a floor of polished stone. The chamber was vast, far larger than any natural cave. Its ceiling soared up into darkness beyond the reach of his lantern light, and in the center of the chamber, growing up from the floor and reaching toward that invisible ceiling, was a tree, but no tree like any Thomas had ever seen. Its trunk was silver, its bark smooth as metal, its branches spread in patterns that seemed to follow some mathematical principle beyond Thomas's understanding. And from those branches hung lights, not leaves but points of illumination, thousands of them, like stars captured and held in arboreal form. Thomas approached slowly, his lantern shaking in his hand. The tree seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, and he realized he could hear it, or not hear it exactly, but sense it, a deep thrumming that he felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It was alive, undeniably, impossibly alive. He walked around it, circling the trunk, and found words carved into the stone floor, written in a language he did not recognize. But as he looked at them, their meaning became clear, as though the understanding bypassed language entirely and entered his mind directly. "Here grows the heart of the world," the inscription read. "Here the boundaries are thin. What is built above must be tended below, and what is tended below sustains what is built above. This is the covenant to maintain the threshold, to keep watch, to ensure the balance holds." Thomas looked up at the tree, at its impossible branches and captured stars, and he understood. Thornwood was not just a house. It was a guardian post, built at a place where the normal world touched something else, something vast and strange and beautiful. The tree was a kind of anchor, holding that boundary stable, preventing it from fraying or failing. And the Ashfords who had lived at Thornwood had been, whether they knew it or not, the tree's keepers charged with ensuring that the house stood and the threshold remained protected. Edmund had known this. He had accepted the responsibility gladly, had dedicated his life to it. Thomas's grandfather had discovered it and been overwhelmed by the weight of what it meant. And now Thomas stood before the silver tree, faced with the same choice. He could leave. He could sell Thornwood, return to his former life, let someone else deal with impossible trees and cosmic responsibilities. Or he could stay. He could accept the role that generations of his family had held, could become in truth what he had already begun to be, Thornwood's guardian. The tree pulsed, and Thomas felt something like a question in that rhythm. The house itself was asking, through the tree, through the mechanism of stone and timber that Edmund had built, whether Thomas would accept the trust. He reached out and placed his palm against the silver bark. It was warm, alive, and he felt recognition flow between them, the tree knowing him, he knowing the tree, and a chord reached without words. "Yes," Thomas said aloud, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I'll stay. I'll be what you need me to be." The tree's lights brightened, and Thomas felt a joy that was not his own wash through him, the relief and gladness of something that had waited too long without proper care finally receiving what it required. The covenant was renewed, the compact re-established, and Thomas Ashford became in that moment truly master of Thornwood, not through inheritance of property, but through acceptance of duty. He stayed in the chamber for a long time, sitting with his back against the tree's trunk, letting its rhythm synchronize with his heartbeat, learning the feel of this new relationship. The tree showed him things, visions, perhaps, or memories of times long past, of the world as it had been when the boundaries were new, when magic and mystery had not yet retreated to hidden places. He saw why this location mattered, what confluence of forces made it significant. He saw the danger of what would happen if the threshold failed, if the boundary collapsed, and the two worlds crashed together without proper mediation. The responsibility was immense, but Thomas found he did not fear it. Instead, he felt a strange peace, as though he had been searching for purpose all his life, and had finally found it in this impossible chamber beneath an impossible house. When he finally climbed the stairs again, emerging into the cellar, he found that dawn had come. He had been below all night, though it had felt like mere hours. The iron door stood open still, and Thomas left it that way. There was no need for locks and secrecy now. He was the guardian. The house trusted him. He climbed to the ground floor and found Mrs. Bramwell already at work in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She looked up as he entered, took in his disheveled appearance, and said nothing, only poured him tea and set out bread and butter. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, drinking the tea, feeling its warmth spread through him. Through the window, he could see the workers arriving for another day's labor on the Manor's restoration. Life continued ordinary and mundane, even as extraordinary mysteries dwelt beneath Thornwood's foundations. "The house seems particularly pleased this morning," Mrs. Bramwell observed, setting jam on the table. "There's a lightness to it I haven't felt before." "It has what it needs now," Thomas said. "A proper guardian," Mrs. Bramwell nodded as though this made perfect sense. "That's well, then. A house like this shouldn't be left to fend for itself." The restoration continued through summer and into autumn. The Manor's systems were updated where necessary, plumbing improved, wiring modernized, heating made more efficient. But the essential character of Thornwood remained unchanged, its rooms still filled with the furniture and appointments that had accumulated over centuries, its walls still bearing the portraits of Ashford's past. Thomas established routines. Each morning he would walk the grounds, checking on the gardens, the outbuildings, the forest edges. Each afternoon he would attend to correspondence and business matters, managing the estate's affairs. Each evening he would descend to the chamber below and sit with the silver tree, maintaining the connection, ensuring the balance held. He found that the tree communicated in subtle ways, showing him what needed attention. A weak point in the boundary would manifest as a particular branch dimming, and Thomas would go to the corresponding location above ground and find something requiring repair, a loose stone in the garden wall, a gap in the forest fence. By fixing these physical problems, he maintained the metaphysical boundary. The two were connected, the material and the mysterious, each supporting the other. Word spread gradually through the village that Thornwood was occupied again. properly inhabited rather than merely restored. Invitations arrived, requesting Thomas's presence at village functions, local gatherings. He accepted where appropriate, building relationships with his neighbors, establishing himself as a member of the community rather than a reclusive lord in his manor house. But he also protected his solitude when needed. Some evenings he wanted no company but Thornwood's, content to sit in the library reading or in the music room teaching himself the pianoforte. The house seemed to appreciate these quiet times, settling around him with satisfaction, its peculiar consciousness, aware and approving. Autumn brought migrating birds and changing leaves, and the grounds around Thornwood became a riot of color. Thomas hired an artist from the village to paint the manor in its seasonal glory, and the resulting work captured something essential about the place. Not just its physical beauty, but its quality of presence, the sense that it was more than the sum of its stones. On the anniversary of his return to Thornwood, Thomas held a celebration, inviting the village to tour the restored manor. Hundreds came, marveling at what had been accomplished, praising the work done. Thomas moved through the crowd, accepting compliments and thanks. But his mind was partially elsewhere, aware always of the silver tree growing in the depths below, the true heart of everything that made Thornwood matter. That night, after the guests had departed and silence had returned, Thomas descended to the chamber. He had brought no lantern this time, had learned that the tree's own light was sufficient. He sat against its trunk and felt its contentment, its satisfaction in being properly tended after so long neglected. "We'll do well together," Thomas told the tree, or told himself, or told the house, or told all three at once, for they were connected now in ways that made such distinctions meaningless. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed. I'll keep the covenant." The tree's lights pulsed in response, and Thomas felt that same joy he had sensed at their first contact, the gladness of duty recognized and accepted. He closed his eyes and let the tree's rhythm carry him into a state between sleeping and waking, where visions came more clearly. He saw Thornwood as it would be in 100 years, 200, 300, still standing, still guarded, still holding the threshold. He saw others who would come after him, other Ashfords, or perhaps not Ashfords at all, but people who would recognize the same call, feel the same pull. The house would endure because it had to endure, because its purpose transcended any individual guardian. And he saw dimly the world that pressed against the boundary the tree maintained, a place of wonder and terror, a beauty that would drive mortals mad, and truth that would shatter lesser minds. It was kept separate, not because it was evil, but because mixture without mediation would destroy both realms. The boundary was mercy, and Thornwood was the key that kept the lock engaged. Thomas opened his eyes and found himself back in ordinary awareness, still sitting against the silver trunk. Above him, through layers of stone and earth and manor house, the moon would be rising over the eastern gardens. Thornwood breathed around him, and he breathed with it, synchronized and content. It was home, truly home, in a way that went deeper than childhood memories or family heritage. He was home because he had found his purpose, his place, his part to play in the vast machinery of existence. And Thornwood had found its guardian, the one who would stay when others had fled, who would maintain what others had abandoned. The manor's windows glowed warm in the autumn night, welcoming and steadfast, and if anyone had been watching from the village or the forest, they would have seen a house that looked utterly ordinary, completely mundane, exactly as a manor house should look. They would not have known about the silver tree or the cosmic boundary, or the strange covenant that bound human guardian to impossible duty. But Thomas knew and Thornwood knew, and that was enough. The mysteries would remain mysteries, hidden in plain sight, protected by stone walls and ordinary appearance. The work would continue, quiet and essential, as it had continued for 300 years, and would continue for 300 more. In the library, Edmund's journals rested on their shelf, his wisdom preserved for future readers. In the cellar, the iron door stood open, no longer needing to be locked because the right guardian had come. And in the chamber below, the silver tree grew and thrived, its captured stars shining in the darkness, marking the place where worlds touched and covenant held. Thomas Ashford had reclaimed the manor, and in doing so had reclaimed himself, finding in duty and purpose the thing that had been missing from his life. Thornwood had returned to life, and life had returned to Thornwood, and in that mutual restoration something precious had been preserved, a threshold, a boundary, a place where the impossible remained possible, and the ancient covenant still held. The house settled into night, its timbers creaking familiar songs, its stones holding warmth against the cooling air. And in its depths, guardian and tree kept watch together, maintaining the balance, holding the line, ensuring that what needed to remain separate stayed separate, and what needed to touch could touch safely. This was the work now. This was the life. And Thomas, sitting in the darkness with starlight held in silver branches above him, could imagine no better purpose, no higher calling, than this: to be Thornwood's keeper, to maintain the covenant, to serve the mystery that dwelt beneath the ordinary, waiting and watching and holding fast. The manor stood on its hill, surrounded by forest and gardens and lake, and it would stand thus for centuries more, a sentinel at the edge of the known world, a guardian of boundaries, a keeper of secrets. And as long as it stood, the balance would hold, the threshold would remain, and the covenant would endure. Thomas closed his eyes and felt the tree's rhythm in his blood, the house's presence in his bones, and knew that he had finally found where he belonged, not in the world of ordinary concerns and mundane achievements, but here, in this place where duty met everything and mystery ran deep as the foundations of the earth. Thornwood was home, and Thomas was its guardian, and the story that had begun with Edmund 3 centuries ago continued now with new dedication, new commitment, new faith that some things mattered more than comfort or ease or safety. The covenant held, the balance remained. And in a manor house that was more than it appeared, a man who had found his purpose kept watch over wonders, holding the line between worlds, maintaining the threshold, serving mysteries he barely understood, but had accepted with his whole heart. This was Thornwood, reclaimed and restored and renewed. And this was Thomas Ashford, guardian and keeper and servant of something vast and strange and essential. And in the quiet darkness of autumn night, with starlight shining in silver branches, an ancient duty, renewed both house and guardian, rested content, knowing that the work would continue, the watch would hold, and the covenant would endure, as long as stones stood and willing hearts accepted the call. The manor's lights dimmed one by one as Thomas finally ascended from the chamber, leaving the tree to its eternal vigil, returning to the world of ordinary life that continued above, even as extraordinary mystery thrived below. He climbed the stairs from cellar to ground floor, walked through the entrance hall where portraits watched with knowing eyes, ascended the grand staircase to the bedroom where fire still burned low in the hearth. He lay down, finally, and let sleep take him, secure in the knowledge that Thornwood stood strong around him, that the covenant was intact, that his choice to stay had been the right one, the only one that mattered. And as he drifted into dreams, the house breathed with him, content at last complete, at last guarded and guardian, both serving the mystery that had called it into being and would sustain it through all the years to come. In the village, lights went dark as people slept, unaware of what their local manor truly protected, what service it performed, what boundary it maintained. They knew only that Thornwood was inhabited again, that the Ashford who had returned seemed committed to staying, that the old house looked better than it had in decades. And that was as it should be. The mysteries were not for everyone. Some truths needed protecting. Some knowledge required readiness. Thornwood stood as it had always stood, in plain sight, yet hidden, ordinary yet extraordinary, a house that was simply a house to those who looked without seeing, and a cosmic threshold to those who understood. Thomas slept, and dreamed of silver trees and captured stars, of boundaries held and covenants kept, of duty accepted and purpose found, and Thornwood watched over him as it had watched over all its guardians, this strange and wonderful house that had chosen its builders as much as it had been chosen by them. The night deepened, and the stars wheeled overhead, and in the chamber far below, the silver tree glowed steady and sure, marking the spot where worlds touched and separation held, where the impossible thrived in protected secrecy, where ancient compact still governed, and guardian's watch still mattered. This was Thornwood, reclaimed and restored, alive once more with purpose and presence and the quiet dedication of a man who had found his calling in the most unexpected place. The manor that had waited so long had its guardian again, and the guardian who had searched so long had found his home. And in that mutual completion, something precious continued, a tradition of service, a practice of vigilance, a commitment to maintaining the boundaries that kept both worlds safe. And so the story that had begun with Edmund's decision to build on marked ground, that had continued through generations of Ashfords who had understood or fled or endured, that had paused for 30 years of abandonment, now resumed with Thomas as its latest chapter, its newest guardian, its current keeper of the covenant that made Thornwood more than just a house, and made its guardian more than just its owner. The fire burned to ash in the bedroom hearth. The moon set beyond the western windows, and Thornwood stood through the night, as it had stood for 300 years, as it would stand for 300 more, keeping its watch, holding its threshold, serving its purpose with the quiet persistence of stone and timber and human dedication combined.